What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because here is what actually happened to me without any dressing up or dramatic soundtrack, just the plain version that still makes my stomach tighten when I replay it. Which is that I sat through my aunt's anniversary dinner while she handed out presents to everyone she said had made her proud this year, one neat stack after another with names that sounded like a roll call for good children. And when my name never came up, I did not make a scene, I did not ask a single question. I simply felt that cold little click you feel when a door you thought was yours slides shut and you realize you are standing on the wrong side of it. I wish I could tell you I laughed it off or cracked a joke that landed, but what I actually did was watch the way the cards were labeled, identical loops in the handwriting that did not look like my aunt's shaky slant. And I noticed how my cousin Brooke hovered close enough to collect thank yous and steer conversations while my uncle pretended to study the menu he had seen 100 times. And I decided I would not feed anyone the satisfaction of a hurt performance, because the only thing that matters in moments like that is what you keep, not what you spill. So I kept my face still, I kept my voice even, and I kept one receipt that nobody saw me take, which was a single photo of the gift table taken from just far enough away to capture the cards and their neat order, and then I asked for my bill, left a normal tip, said I had an early morning, and walked out while the applause for someone else's achievement was still floating around like confetti that does not know where to land, and I did not cry in the car or call a friend to vent, because I knew that anything I said in that mood would turn into ammunition for someone who lives for the words messy and emotional. On the ride home, I replayed the phrasing my aunt used when she stood up to make her little toast, because it sounded rehearsed in a way she is not, the exact line about everyone who made me proud delivered like a headline she had practiced. And I could hear Brooke in that phrase the way you hear a familiar song in a new commercial, and the more I sat with it, the more it stopped feeling like a judgment about my worth and started feeling like a script someone else had handed her to manage the optics of a party that looked generous and organized while quietly pruning the branches that do not flatter the picture. I am not saying I was fine, because I was not, but I was clear, and clarity makes room for choices. So when I got home, I sent my aunt a message that did not accuse and did not beg. Just a short paragraph with the photo attached and a line that said, if this was truly how you feel, I hear you and I will step back with respect, and if this is not how you feel, I am here when you want to talk. Which is the kind of message that makes people reveal themselves, because it takes away the easy fight and leaves only the truth of their intention. About an hour later, after I had washed my face and told myself I would not check my phone again, it rang with my aunt's name, and when I answered, I heard her crying in that tired way that belongs more to fear than to sadness. And she apologized without saying for what exactly, and I could hear a whisper in the background that sounded like someone coaching her to say, "Let us talk tomorrow," and she repeated it as if it were a safety rope. And I kept my voice steady and said, there is no emergency. I just want to understand what changed and who decided I do not make you proud anymore. She said I never said that, which landed like a glass set down too hard on a table, and then she backpedaled into something about how I seemed busy with my own life, which is not an answer, it is a narrative. And I told her I am always busy and always here, and those two things can exist at the same time, and I asked if we could meet for coffee the next day without anyone else, just us, and for a second she hesitated like a person glancing at a closed door. And then she said yes, quickly, the way a person says yes when they do not want to be overheard. The part of me that wanted to scream at Brooke for playing event manager with people's dignity did not get a turn, because I kept the boundary I set for myself, which is that I would not make this about volume or performance. And instead I wrote down the one detail that mattered, which was that the cards were all in somebody else's handwriting and the phrasing came out of my aunt's mouth like a line on a teleprompter, and I made a quiet decision that whatever came next would be about receipts and timing and protecting my aunt from being used as a shield, not about humiliating anyone with a loud confrontation that would only give them a story to tell about me. Before I went to bed, I got one more text from my aunt that said, please do not send that photo in the family chat. Brooke will explain tomorrow, and I stared at the word explain because it confirmed what I already suspected, which is that there was an explanation and it did not live in my aunt's heart, and I replied that I would not share anything with anyone and that I would see her in the morning, and then I put my phone face down and lay awake thinking about how quickly pride turns into a tool when someone learns they can weaponize it to move people around. If you are wondering why I did not call my parents or loop in a cousin who likes me, here is the truth I have learned the slow way, which is that when a story is being managed, the first person to react becomes the villain. And I was not going to give Brooke the gift of my outrage, because outrage is loud and easy to frame, while patience is quiet and very hard to fight, and I wanted hard to fight on my side for once. So that was the first move, not glamorous and not theatrical, just a well-timed exit. A single photo that captured what words would only muddy, and a message that split the situation into two simple paths. Either this is really how you feel and I can respect it even if it hurts, or this is not your voice and you might need someone to protect it until you get it back, and I was ready for either outcome, though I suspected which one we were heading toward. Just before midnight, my phone lit up again with a shorter message that knocked the air out of me more than the dinner had, because it said, "Actually, can we talk alone?" And there was no coaching in that line, only urgency. And that was the moment I knew the gift table was not a measure of my worth, but a map to whoever was drawing the boundaries around my aunt's voice, and I decided that in the morning I would start pulling the first thread and see who tugged back. The next morning I showed up at the diner my aunt suggested, and the moment she slid into the booth I could see she was carrying something heavy she had no idea how to put down. Because instead of greeting me with her usual casual chatter, she immediately apologized again in a way that sounded less like her words and more like someone else's idea of what an apology should sound like, and I sat there stirring my coffee, waiting. Because I had learned over the years that if you let people keep talking without filling the silence for them, eventually the truth leaks through the cracks they are trying to patch. She finally admitted that Brooke had handled the logistics of the party, which on the surface sounded like she was just delegating errands. But the more she explained, the more it was obvious that logistics had expanded to include things like deciding the language of the speech, writing out the names on the envelopes, and even suggesting who should be included in the circle of those who supposedly made her proud. I did not have to ask how far that authority went, because she said it outright. Brooke told her I was busy with my own life and probably would not even want the attention, and she had believed it because, in her words, I had seemed distant lately. Which cut deeper than I expected because it showed me how easily absence gets rewritten into indifference if someone is motivated enough to control the narrative. I leaned forward and asked one very simple question, not with anger but with clarity, which was, who actually picked the names, and she hesitated, then whispered, "Brooke made the list." And it hit me that she was confessing something that sounded small, but carried the weight of everything that had happened at the dinner, because if my aunt had not even written her own list, then the words about pride were never hers. They were just borrowed lines on a family stage. I asked the next question, who wrote the cards, and again she admitted Brooke did, saying she thought her handwriting was too shaky and messy to look nice. Finally, I asked the one that really mattered, "Did you ever actually say that I do not make you proud?" And she looked away and said no, never, and she seemed to realize as she said it that the whole story had been engineered without her noticing, like someone slowly moving her hands off the wheel while convincing her she was still driving. That was the moment I knew this was not about a dinner slight or a forgotten gift bag. It was about who was speaking with her voice when she was not paying attention, and I decided the only way forward was to create proof she could not later deny or minimize. I told her, calmly, that I was not asking her to fight anyone today. I was only asking if she would forward me any messages where Brooke had spoken for her, just so I could understand where things had shifted. She looked nervous, glancing around like we were doing something shady, but she nodded, and within a few hours I got a chain of emails on my phone that made my chest tighten, because right there in black and white was a draft spreadsheet titled Approved Recipients, with little notes next to each name, and next to mine, in Brooke's neat typing, it said remove. No explanation, no reason, just that one word, as if my relationship with my aunt could be erased with a keystroke. Attached to the chain was an invoice labeled Event Consulting, which apparently Brooke had submitted for her own planning work, and although the dollar amount was not huge, the principle of it reeked of self-dealing. I sat staring at the screen, thinking about how many times I had heard people say families fight over money, but it almost never starts with money, it starts with influence. And money just becomes the visible scoreboard once someone has already seized control of the story. I did not send the emails to anyone else yet, because timing is everything, and I wanted to be certain before I moved, but I did reply to my aunt and said, "Thank you for trusting me with this. And I promise I will not share it with anyone without your permission," which was both a reassurance and a test, because if Brooke was monitoring her messages, she would know something had shifted. Later that evening, my aunt called again, her voice softer, almost childlike, and she said she had not realized how much control she had given away until she saw it all laid out in writing, and she admitted she felt embarrassed. Which told me exactly why Brooke had been able to manipulate her, because embarrassment is the leash people use when they want to keep someone quiet. I told her that embarrassment is only possible if you think you have to hide the truth, and the truth here was simple. She had been convinced to let someone else decide what love and pride should look like, and that was not weakness, it was misplaced trust, which happens to everyone when they stop checking the details. I told her the important part was not how it happened, but what she wanted to do now that she could see it clearly. She did not answer right away, but she did ask if we could meet again the next day, this time at her house, just the two of us, no Brooke, and I said yes, knowing full well that the next meeting would not just be about emotions, it would be about evidence and decisions. As I hung up the phone that night, I realized that the family dinner, which had seemed like a public humiliation, was actually just the opening move in something much bigger, and by keeping my composure I had stumbled into an advantage I had not even planned. Because I now had proof, I had my aunt's quiet cooperation, and I had Brooke's handwriting and typing lined up like breadcrumbs that could not be swept away. The question was no longer whether I was proud enough in my aunt's eyes, it was whether she was ready to reclaim her own voice before it disappeared under the weight of Brooke's logistics. And while I did not say it out loud yet, in my head I promised myself that if Brooke wanted to treat this like a managed event, then I would show her what happens when someone refuses to play by the script she thought she controlled. When I sat down at my desk the following morning and opened the forwarded chain of messages again, I realized this was no longer just about family politics or even the insult of being cut from a list of so-called achievements, because what I was holding in front of me was the first tangible sign that my aunt's decisions were not entirely her own, and if someone was brazen enough to write "remove Lauren" in an email draft that my aunt was supposed to approve, then what else had been quietly signed, authorized, or redirected without her full understanding? The invoice labeled as consulting kept pulling at me, because even though the sum was not life-changing money, it represented a principle that I could not ignore. And that principle was that Brooke had found a way to profit from controlling not just the event itself, but the very image of my aunt's pride. I knew from experience in my own job that once someone establishes themselves as the gatekeeper, they rarely stop at party planning, because the real payoff always lies in access to accounts, signatures, and decisions that affect the future, not just the optics of a single evening. I decided to reach out to a friend of mine who works in elder law, not because my aunt is incapable or fragile, but because I needed a sober read on whether what I was seeing qualified as concerning or simply petty family friction dressed up as scandal. I laid out the situation without names, framing it as a hypothetical, and my friend immediately asked a set of questions that made me realize how far this could go if ignored. Who manages her communication? Who speaks for her in writing? Has anyone been introduced as a financial advisor without independent vetting, and has there been a recent pattern of isolation from certain relatives? I had to answer yes to almost all of those, and when my friend said to keep records, document everything, and never rely on verbal promises, it clicked for me that this was no longer about whether I had been insulted at a dinner, but about whether my aunt's autonomy was slipping away one quiet concession at a time. That afternoon I asked my aunt, gently, if she would be open to letting me take a look at the agreement she had signed with the so-called new advisor that Brooke had introduced, and though she was clearly anxious, she said yes. Mostly because I framed it as protecting her reputation rather than exposing her vulnerability. When she sent me a scanned copy, My stomach tightened again, because right there on the first page the primary contact was listed as Brooke, not Denise, which meant that any correspondence or alerts would go directly to her first. And buried deeper in the fine print were management fees that were not outrageous, but noticeably higher than market standard, which in my mind suggested that the advisor was not hired for expertise, but for convenience, specifically Brooke's convenience. The most alarming part was that the signature line was incomplete, showing only initials in certain places and no final signature on a disclosure page, which raised the possibility that my aunt had been told to just initial here, without a full explanation of what she was committing to. I knew better than to confront Brooke directly, because she thrived on turning conflict into evidence of my instability, so instead I drafted a careful, calm, almost clinical summary of what I had found. I wrote down the timeline, the details of the advisor agreement, the fees, the missing signatures, and the forwarded email where Brooke had literally typed "remove Lauren." I addressed it to my aunt and uncle together, copied Brooke for transparency, and ended the message with a simple suggestion that it might be wise to have a neutral third-party review of these arrangements, just to ensure everything was above board. I did not accuse, I did not speculate, I did not add emotion, because I wanted the power of the facts to speak louder than any defensive spin that would inevitably follow. The response came faster than I expected, and it was exactly the kind of reaction I had anticipated, because within minutes Brooke replied with a polished but furious message accusing me of creating drama, undermining family trust, and misrepresenting her efforts to help Aunt Denise. She insisted the advisor was reputable, that she was only listed as primary contact for convenience since my aunt doesn't check her email regularly, and that I was stirring conflict out of jealousy. Not long after, a follow-up email came directly from the advisor, which was meant to be reassuring, but actually confirmed my suspicions, because he described Brooke as his point of contact and admitted that he had not yet met my aunt in person, which made it painfully clear who had really orchestrated the arrangement. The attempt at defense only deepened the problem, because by trying to explain away the setup, they had revealed that Brooke had been the one authorizing communications and decisions. My aunt called me later that night, voice trembling, saying she had not realized she was not the primary contact, and that she felt humiliated to discover it this way. I told her that humiliation was exactly what Brooke would count on to keep her silent, and that the only way to take back control was not to hide, but to step forward and reassert her own authority. I reminded her that she had the right to rescind agreements, to demand transparency, and to decide who spoke for her, and I said I would stand with her if she chose to act, but I would also respect her choice if she preferred to let it go. That silence stretched for a long moment, and then she whispered, "I want to fix this, but I am scared of the fallout." As I hung up, I realized we were no longer dealing with an isolated dinner slight or a manipulative cousin seeking applause, but a situation with legal, financial, and emotional stakes that could alter my aunt's independence for years to come. And while part of me wanted to charge in and tear down Brooke's control in one loud confrontation, I knew the smarter move was to let the facts keep stacking until the weight of them made it impossible for anyone, even my uncle, to dismiss what was happening. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was no longer just reacting but quietly setting the pace, and I had a strong sense that the next step would not come from me alone, but from the circle of people my aunt actually trusted, the ones who had begun whispering already that something about that dinner had not felt like her at all. I did not plan a summit or some grand intervention with speeches and pointed fingers, because that kind of theater always gives the manipulator a fresh stage and a new costume to play the victim. So when my aunt's oldest friend Marcia called me after someone had quietly shown her the photo from the dinner and said, in that gentle way only a person who has known you since childhood can manage, that the whole proud list felt wrong in her bones, and that Denise had sounded scripted, I simply asked whether she would host a small coffee at her place where people who genuinely cared about my aunt could sit without performance and listen without being hurted. And when she said yes, I knew the ground had shifted in a way Brooke would not see coming. Because nothing rattles a controller like a conversation they cannot contain. We met 2 days later around Marcia's kitchen table with cups that did not match and a plate of store cookies no one touched, and I started by saying I did not want anyone to pile on or make my aunt feel cornered, but I did want to walk through a timeline that had turned my stomach, and I wanted to do it slowly and plainly so there would be no confusion about what had been decided in her name. I laid out the messages my aunt had forwarded. I read the draft line that said, "Remove Lauren." I showed the advisor agreement with Brooke listed as the primary contact and the missing signature on the disclosure page. And then I put my phone down and turned to my aunt and asked her to tell us, in her own words, whether any of this matched what she believed she had agreed to. For a long moment she did not look at anyone, and I could feel the familiar urge to fill the silence, but I did not, because I knew that if I spoke for her now I would repeat the same mistake everyone else had been making. And then she took a breath and said, in a voice that was small but steady, that she had never told anyone to remove me, that she had not chosen the phrase about pride, and that she had let Brooke handle more than she should because it felt easier, and the room seemed to exhale at once, not with relief exactly, but with the strange calm that arrives when a shared suspicion becomes a shared fact. Uncle Ray, who had been leaning against the counter like he might bolt at the first sign of drama, cleared his throat and admitted that he had not liked the fees either. Yet he had gone along because the party felt like a freight train he could not stop without derailing the evening his wife had wanted so badly, which told me he was not an enemy so much as a man who had chosen peace over clarity until the cost of peace had become embarrassment. Marcia reached for my aunt's hand and said the simplest possible sentence, that none of this sounded like Denise, and that was the permission my aunt needed to say the thing that mattered most, which was that she wanted her voice back and did not know how to take it without setting off a war. I told her we could do it without a war if we were precise, because the same way Brooke had built control through small steps labeled logistics, we could dismantle that control through small steps labeled protection. And that the first and most important step was a rule that would sound almost too basic to matter but would change everything, which was that from this moment forward no one sends a message in my aunt's name unless my aunt writes it herself or sits beside them and reads every word aloud before it goes, and we all agreed to treat that as a line no one could cross without announcing their intentions. We helped my aunt change her email password to something only she knew. We turned on alerts to her phone so she would see any access changes in real time. And we scheduled a meeting with a fiduciary recommended by Marcia's church friend who handles elderly clients with a level of protection that would make any light-fingered advisor deeply uncomfortable. And while we were doing these practical things, I watched my aunt's shoulders lower in a way I had not seen since before the party, because action has a way of dissolving shame that apologies never touch. Predictably, just when the mood in the room had shifted from confusion to resolve, Brooke arrived uninvited with the brittle smile of someone who thinks she is about to rescue a situation from chaos. And when she saw phones out and a list of tasks on the table, she snapped that we were hijacking Aunt Denise's accounts and poisoning the family against her, which would have landed harder if she had not followed it up by demanding that any changes be run through her for consistency, thereby confirming in one breath the very control she was trying to deny. My aunt did something then that almost made me cry, not because it was dramatic but because it was clean, as she turned to Brooke and said, without raising her voice, that these are my accounts and my words and my decisions, and you may help me if I ask you to. And you may step back if I do not. And for the first time since this began, I watched Brooke look genuinely unsure of her footing, because she had relied on my aunt's conflict avoidance like a bridge that would never collapse, and now she was seeing hairline cracks that would widen each time my aunt chose to speak for herself. Brooke tried to pivot into the familiar language of family loyalty, implying that airing concerns in front of outsiders would damage reputations and create gossip that would be hard to manage. But that argument only works when people care more about looking whole than being safe, and this circle of friends, who had watched Denise carry everyone else's burdens for years without complaint, was not interested in image management anymore. I told Brooke, as calmly as I could manage, that we would be sending a neutral request for an independent review of the advisor's arrangement, that we would be documenting all communications where she had acted as primary contact, and that we would be doing so with my aunt's permission and participation, and if she wanted to stay in the process, she was welcome as long as she respected the new rule about my aunt's voice. If not, she could step back and allow professionals to do their work, but either way, the days of silent approvals were over. She glared at me, told my aunt she would regret letting me turn this into a spectacle, and stormed out with a parting shot about consequences, which landed with less force than she intended because real consequences were already in motion. And they were not the kind that thrive on whispers. After she left, my aunt sat very still, and then she laughed. Not a happy laugh exactly, but the kind of laugh people make when they realize the monster under the bed was mostly shadow, and she thanked everyone for coming. Which was the most ordinary sentence and yet felt like a new paragraph in her life. On my drive home, I thought about how small the revenge had been on paper and how enormous it felt in practice, because I had not humiliated anyone or blown up a dinner or delivered a speech that would get clipped out of context. I had simply helped my aunt put her hand back on the wheel and told the person who kept nudging it away that the ride was over, and in families like ours that kind of boundary is not a slogan. It is a revolution conducted in quiet hours with passwords, calendars, and one sentence said out loud in a kitchen where the cookies went stale while the truth finally took a seat. The night after Brooke stormed out of Marcia's kitchen, my phone rang just past midnight, and her name flashed across the screen like an alarm I had been expecting but still dreaded, because I knew she would not retreat quietly. She never did. And what followed was less a conversation than a performance designed to reclaim the control she had felt slip away from her grasp. She began in a tone dripping with false calm, insisting that she had cut me from the proud list, not out of malice, but out of practicality, claiming that I had grown too distant from the family, too focused on my career and my own life to care about the symbolic gestures that meant so much to my aunt, and she framed it as if she were protecting me from embarrassment, as if receiving no gift was better than being handed one she believed I would not appreciate. It was the kind of revisionist reasoning that sounds almost plausible if you hear it once, but I had heard this tactic too many times before to let it pass, so instead of rising to the bait, I asked her if she really believed absence and indifference were the same thing, and before she could twist my words, I began listing, calmly and without edge, the moments no one else had seen. The hospital rides at dawn when my aunt had been too anxious to drive herself, the paperwork I had quietly completed when she could not make sense of insurance jargon, the hours I had spent listening to her fears about getting older and more alone. All of it done without applause or announcement. Each example landed with a weight she did not expect, and though she tried to interrupt with claims that those moments had been exaggerated or misunderstood, her voice faltered when she realized she could not erase what I had witnessed firsthand. When her attempt to paint me as distant failed, she pivoted to money, as I knew she would, insisting that I had no right to meddle in financial matters I did not understand, that the advisor she had introduced was vetted and competent, and that my aunt had explicitly given her authority to handle the details because she trusted her judgment. I let her finish her monologue without cutting in, because I knew patience unnerved her, and when she finally ran out of words, I reminded her of one undeniable fact. I had already filed a simple notice with the Consumer Protection Office requesting an independent review of the advisor's credentials and agreements, attaching the email chain with her edits, the invoice for consulting, and the contract listing her as primary contact. I told her this not with anger, but with the plain steadiness of someone who no longer needed her permission, and I heard the silence on the other end stretch out long enough to confirm that she had not anticipated I would take that step. She tried to laugh it off, saying reviews happen all the time and nothing would come of it, but the thinness in her laugh betrayed her worry, because she understood as well as I did that exposure, not legality, was her greatest enemy. The next day, at my aunt's request, we met for lunch at a diner she loved because it was unpretentious and always smelled faintly of burnt coffee, and she slid a single sealed card across the table with her shaky hands, saying only, "I wrote this myself." I opened it slowly, expecting something ceremonial, but inside, in her own uneven handwriting, were the simplest words I had ever received from her. "I am proud of you for not needing the stage to do the right thing." I did not read it aloud. I did not show it to anyone else. I just held it close because it was proof that no matter how hard someone had tried to script her voice, she could still speak in her own language when given the chance. That one line carried more weight than all the envelopes from the anniversary dinner combined, because it was not about performance, it was about recognition that could not be engineered by anyone else. I thanked her without theatrics, just a quiet nod and a squeeze of her hand, and she smiled in a way that told me she finally understood the difference between being managed and being respected. Later that week, in a family call that included Uncle Ray and Brooke, my aunt asserted a boundary I had been waiting to hear for weeks, saying clearly that from now on she would keep her own accounts, write her own words, and make her own decisions. And anyone who wanted to remain in her life had to respect that line without exceptions. Brooke attempted to protest, to soften the boundary into a guideline, but my aunt did not bend this time, repeating that her accounts were hers, her voice was hers, and her choices were hers. And the call ended with a silence that felt less like awkwardness and more like a quiet transfer of power. A few days later, the advisor's name was gone from her contacts, replaced with a new fiduciary who had no ties to Brooke, and though the transition was messy in its paperwork, the principle was already secure. My aunt's autonomy had been restored. Not because I had shouted the loudest, but because I had chosen receipts, patience, and timing over noise. On the final evening of that week, I received one last message from Brooke, a short line that read, "You think you won." I stared at it for a while before replying no. Denise did. And that was the truest revenge of all, because it was not about humiliating her or stripping her of dignity. It was about returning the power to the person who had been quietly robbed of it under the disguise of help. I did not gloat. I did not share the card from the diner with anyone else. I did not circulate proof to the wider family, because victory did not require an audience, it required permanence. And permanence had been achieved when my aunt finally said no more on her own terms. Driving home that night, I thought about how people imagine revenge as fireworks and shouting, but the sweetest version is the one where the manipulator realizes too late that the stage they built for themselves has been dismantled plank by plank, leaving them with no spotlight and no script to hide behind, while the person they tried to control steps back into her own story. And that was enough, more than enough, because for the first time in years my aunt's voice was truly hers again, and mine was no longer the quiet one left off the list, but the one that helped her write her own name back where it always belonged.